wondered why stories about true crime, dark, macabre, or chilling events are fascinating? Well, I believe that some of us are hardwired to survive, and that wiring urges us to seek out information and share stories of events that others would consider unsettling. Perhaps you get a rush when you hear a tale about a horrific event, but really it's the insight about how to survive if ever the situation happened to you. And thankfully, that knowledge will help you feel empowered to make the choices to keep yourself safe. This is my goal. Hello, lovelies, and thank you for joining me. I'm Madam Roman. I discuss true crime, dark histories, mysteries, mayhem, and anything else that interests me. Sometimes I take a look at things from a different perspective. I like to delve into the possibilities of why things happen and why people do things. So if that's something that also interests you, put on your highest red-bottom slippers and get ready to learn how to strut your stuff down the silver brick road to the land of wisdom. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe. The following content contains material intended for mature audiences. Viewer discretion advised. This case is particularly horrific and brutal, so if you're not mature, step the fuck out of line because this shit is about to get real. This case gets me really hot and fired up, so I'm going to try and get through it. Do you know the expression out of the frying pan and into the fire? Or have you ever been in a situation where you think, oh shit, how did this happen? Most of us get into that kind of situation without even realizing it. It's one small decision that leads to another seemingly small decision that ends with some sort of realization that this is more than we bargained for. This was 18-year-old Leslie's realization the moment she was standing in defiance or desperation, bloody, beaten, naked, heart pounding in her chest, holding her breath, hands shaking, pointing the gun at the man in front of her. She was determined to shoot him to survive, but when she pulled the trigger, click, nothing happened. She was pointing the useless toy gun at the man who had been systematically torturing her for the past 12 hours. He had been threatening her with the fake gun the entire time, hoping that she would try to get a hold of it. A sick, sly smile crossed his mustached lips with pleasure at her realization that her fate was in his complete control. What he didn't expect was that her will to live was stronger than his arrogance and control after all. The man with the demented eyes had made one mistake in his complacency and sick, sadistic perversion. He believed that he was in control of her screams, only allowing enough to satiate his sexual desire for a woman's pain. He had not anticipated that this victim would not be controlled with his declaration that he had bought her, or that he would let her live when he was done with her. She believed that she was facing certain death, and after, oh God no, escaped her lips, her reaction was not only to scream, but to emit a sound from the bottom of her very soul in which the vibrations alone would penetrate anyone within range of her. After all, if he was going to kill her anyway, what did she have to lose? She decided she was not going to give up in defeat. She decided that she was going to survive. What Leslie didn't know was that when she decided she was going to survive this, not only was her future changed, but the future of countless other victims that this man would have preyed on after her, as well as the future of the cold, unsolved cases begging for justice that had not been answered. She had unknowingly become the reason most killers are caught, the surviving victim. It was not her intention to come to New York City and become a sex worker. The teenage Leslie had visions of sinking her teeth with voracious delight into the Big Apple, not becoming the recipient of its bloody fangs. She had bravely traveled for long days and nights on a crowded, uncomfortable bus from one shore of the U.S. to another. Her courage had led her to believe in a dream that the journey across the entire country from Olympia, Washington, would materialize a better life in the bustling city rather than the limited opportunities and options that the Pacific Northwest town offered. Perhaps she was running from something rather than to, but it didn't matter to the pimps and the sex traffickers that slithered in the pools of New York, hawking their product of flesh and deprivation to the willing seekers. New York Square at the time was a cesspool likened to the mind's imagination of Dante's Inferno in his 9 circles of hell, with the ooze of perverted deviance assaulting the senses, with smells of sex and fear enthralling the tortured minds of psychopaths, fetishists, and predators. It was with simple little lies that the traffickers were able to lure and capture the vulnerable teenage runaways that entered New York City through the gates of damnation that was the Port Authority bus station. The promises that the pimps would use of care and goodwill that they told the naive prey from Middle America was so prevalent in the area that it was dubbed the Minnesota Strip. With the lies of being housed, fed, and protected, the traffickers would put the newcomers on the street as sex workers, for sale as fresh meat, to repay the kindness the pimp had offered. This was what happened to Leslie. After arriving in New York City and being trapped by a pimp, it was as a sex worker that she met a man who introduced himself as Tommy. Over drinks in a bar, Tommy had coaxed the petite 5'4" blonde into trusting him with kind words and gentle actions. He had told her he was a husband and father of 3. Did he apply his smooth vulnerability, telling her some sob story about his wife not loving him and being cruel? Did he tell her about the wonderful father he was to his children and break down her defenses? He asked questions about her life, expressing sympathy for her plight and letting her know that he wanted to be her friend. He offered to help facilitate her escape by taking her to a bus station in New Jersey to get out of the city and back to safety. This stranger seemed to be a kind soul offering a life raft in a putrid sea of despair and darkness. On their way to the station, he offered to stop for dinner to fill her belly. But before setting back to the bus station, the man asked if he could pay her for sex before she left. The money would help her get on her feet, ironically. This man gained her trust. After all, Johns don't take sex workers out to dinner, drinks, and deliverance from evil. They don't offer to help vulnerable young teenagers in need. At the hotel, he continued to incorporate his soft, caring skills into Leslie's consent to soothe her by letting him give her a massage. She took her clothes off and laid on her stomach on the bed, and the predator seized his prey. He pounced on her back and put a knife to her throat. In his maniacal, cold, sinister voice, he told her to shut up, that she was his whore, that she had to be punished, and that she was his to do with whatever he wanted. After all, he had bought and paid for her. The formerly mild-mannered Tommy said this innumerable times, and that the other girls had taken it, and that she had to take it too. He handcuffed her hands behind her back and proceeded his seemingly endless evil torture. Richard Cottingham was born November 25th, 1946, Sagittarius. Oh boy, so much to unpack there. Those of you who don't know Sages, they have this ability to melt your heart with their vulnerability and tenderness. And once you're relaxed, they turn on a DEF-CON level seduction attention to your sexual energy. They make a sport out of their need for you to fall in love with them, no matter who they truly are. And some of them will use that defenseless attraction to their advantage with an immature disregard for your welfare. They are masters of persuasion and promise with their rhythmic purring in your ear. Well, that was certainly true in this case. Richard was born in the Bronx to William and Anna. He was the last of 3 children. His parents had already had 2 daughters. Good Lord, the only boy and the baby? He did not fit the typical serial killer profile of abused, neglected child having suffered a trauma with animal cruelty tendencies. The family was devout in their Catholic religion, and they were active in their community. William worked at MetLife as vice president in Manhattan and provided well for his family. Anna was a homemaker and devoted to her children with love and care. Richard was a handsome kid who had friends and even raised pigeons and fed deer. During this time in the U.S. and Richard's fundamental years of learning about the world around him, it was not unusual to have graphic magazines whose enticement for purchase was the degradation of women. Covers of voluptuous women bound, clothes ripped, if any, face contorted in fear, helpless, and terror were usually the best predictor of mass demand. Inside the pages were stories of horrific and dehumanizing true crime, detective, war crime stories written with graphic detail about pornography, bondage, and torture, to adventure tales of the South Sea with beheadings, shrunken heads, Ed Gein's favorite, and cannibalism. The plots of savage acts perpetrated against women by men were repeated over and over with heart-pounding torture and terror, the only difference between them being the application. The more the graphic, obscene, and degrading, the better for profit. These depictions were in easy access to anyone at any newspaper stand, candy shop, or grocery store, right next to Time Life and Harper's Bazaar. Richard later attributed his violent and sadistic behavior towards women as having come from this assault on his developing adolescent mind. Of course, in true fashion, for a diagnosed narcissistic psychopathic sexual sadist, it would be quite a feat to self-reflect on his own responsibility into his actions towards women. After his parents decided to join the white flight migration of white people out of the city to the outlying suburbs when Richard was about 7 or 8 years old, it was said that he was a bit ostracized in his new school. Perhaps this bit of rejection shattered his fragile emerging ego, and he allowed his developing deviance to delude rational thought. As in high school, the friends he did have would later say that Richard was the leader of their group. He liked to be in control and was anti-authoritarian, which was reflected when he was caught shoplifting. When he would discuss girls with his friends, he would fetishize and demean them, reducing them to big tits and playthings for his sick desires, which were becoming increasingly sadistic with bondage and torture fantasies. The predatory fare on print media seemed to be a microcosm of the Times Square area in the 1970s, and Richard put himself right in the thick of opportunity. The availability of choose-your-own-adventure and sexual deviation was prolific and without restraint. Sex was being pumped out and marketed in mass, with the main pusher of perversion stating any man has the right to view whatever he feels like viewing, and providing that any man with peep shows that turned into glory holes that turned into live sex shows on stage in front of an audience. And with the sex trade came organized crime, drugs, corruption, violence, and murder. The economic state of New York and the country only fueled the fevered fanatic frenzy that prevailed in Times Square. The city had cut 5,000 police jobs because it no longer had the funds. The area was so dangerous that there was actually a survival guide that was distributed to tourists, visitors, and newcomers. In the late 1960s, after graduating high school and working at MetLife, where his father was vice president, Richard decided to work at MetLife's competitor, Blue Cross Blue Shield, in Manhattan. This defiance angered his father so greatly that he packed up Richard's mother and they moved to Florida, leaving Richard without any family in New York. To me, this suggests that perhaps at a young age, between like 7 and 12 years old, Richard felt pressured and controlled by his parents to meet their expectations and do well in life by following their judgment. He might have perceived his older sisters as good girls, doing what their parents wanted and doing well for themselves. They were likely rewarded with praise from his parents and community, causing jealousy, envy, and anger in Richard. And perhaps his sisters picked on him, as siblings do, and their mockery, in combination with the feelings of inadequacy from his parents and peers, with the violent pornographic magazines as entertainment, was the perfect catalyst for his resentment to turn violently towards women. But I'm no expert. Angering his parents may have been just a bonus in taking the position at Blue Cross Blue Shield. Their leaving New York allowed him freedom to pursue his real interests. His computer skills had allowed him to secure a position in which he could set his own hours, and his salary was very generous. He had married and started a family. Everything was falling into place for Richard's foolproof facade, or so it seemed. On May 22, 1980, the employees at the Quality Inn in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey were still a bit raw. Their nerves were frayed and just recovering from the shock of a young woman that had been found murdered in one of their rooms just 2 weeks before. That day, the housekeeper did not notice anything unusual about the empty room that needed to be cleaned after checkout. There was no luggage, no clothing, no items left behind from the previous occupants. Just another empty room that needed to be cleaned for the next guests. That is, until she realized that she kept hitting something under the bed, preventing the vacuum from cleaning the space. When she knelt down to see, she could not have foreseen the terrifying image that she would not be able to unsee no matter how hard she squeezed her eyes shut. The body of a young, petite, naked woman, staring up with lifeless eyes, her strawberry blonde hair only more red with the blood from her head wounds. She had been severely beaten, hands bound behind her back. The police would later determine that the victim was 19-year-old Valerie Street, a sex worker that had recently arrived from Florida. She had been tortured with strangulation to unconsciousness and then revived to only suffer another strangulation, with the process repeating for hours. Her abuser had taped her mouth shut and handcuffed her while he raped, bit, and sliced her flesh, just to see the tear on her face. There was nothing left of the perpetrator but the handcuffs still on her wrist, and with those, a fingerprint. When the screams of Leslie were heard by other guests, they called down to the reception of the hotel. The employees were terrified that another vicious attack was happening in their hotel. One of the employees went to the room with trepidation and knocked on the door. Leslie opened the door with Tommy standing behind her with a knife to her side. Despite her reassurances that everything was fine, the employee could see that the woman was beaten and battered, and in combination with a small signal that she was able to get that she was in danger, the employee left and called the police. Tommy, or Richard Cottingham, was caught trying to escape the scene. Police realized the similarities to Valerie's murder just 2 weeks before and that of another woman whose body had been found in the same hotel parking lot 3 years earlier. In that case, a 26-year-old nurse by the name of Marianne Carr had been found beaten with ligature marks on her wrists and ankles. She had suffered the same revival strangulation and bites on her breasts as the other two recent cases. It became evident that Leslie's testimony was going to be crucial in any conviction that they would be able to obtain for his crimes. Investigators even began to speculate that in addition to the crimes they believe he committed in New Jersey, the horrific murders of 2 female sex workers in a New York hotel 6 months before that could be the work of a serial killer was possibly perpetrated by Richard Cottingham, a possible serial killer that had left the room on fire at a seedy, drab Travelodge Motor Inn on West 42nd Street, and the dreams of 2 women inside up in smoke. That thick, acrid, choking smoke darkened room 417 and hindered the visibility of fire personnel that were summoned about 9 a.m. December 2nd, 1979. The heat of the fire inside was a stark contrast to the cold, snowy northeast morning after a full moon night. Firefighters could make out 2 separate fires, one on each of the twin beds with someone lying on each. One of the rescuers grabbed the closest victim and brought her out to the hall and was about to perform CPR when he reeled back, horrified to discover there were no lips, there were no eyes, no mouth, because there was no head. A white man about 35 years old, 5'10", 175 pounds, with meticulously blow-dried sandy brown hair and mustache, had registered the room 3 days before the fire under the false name Carl Wilson. It was determined that both female victims had endured those days with bondage, beatings, sexual assaults, and methodical slicing of flesh and biting of breasts to induce extreme terror. The pathological MO of a sexual sadist, in which the progression level of humiliation and degradation is needed for the perpetrator to achieve his desired sexual satisfaction, was evident by the scene. At some point, to heighten his excitement, he made one of the women watch the murder of the other and know that she would be next. After death, the killer had cut off their hands and heads. The dismemberment was precise and meticulously clean, leaving little blood at the scene. Without either victim's head or hands, identification was difficult. However, despite the killer having made sure the room was devoid of any physical evidence, he folded the victim's clothing and placed the piles neatly in the bathtub. Without any witnesses or information to their identities, police dressed mannequins in the women's clothing and sought the public's help in order to try to identify these victims. When the recognition of some of the clothes came for one of the victims, a name and history came as well. Didi Godarzi. At just 22 years old, she was an attractive, slender woman with long brown hair and olive skin. She had come at a young age from Iran to the U.S. to live with her father, but had eventually run away. Life was hard for Didi, and she had become pregnant. She knew that she could not provide for a child and gave her up for adoption 2 weeks after she was born. She was known by many aliases as a high-priced escort that worked New York's higher-end bars, hotels, resorts, and massage parlors. With this clientele, Didi could be selective and only provide services to 2 or 3 clients a day. The shorter, younger victim, thought to be Caucasian, petite at 110 pounds, and about 16 years old. 16. She was a child. A child that should have been thinking about what she wanted to be when she grew up, not how she was going to survive the day with or without having run into this psycho. A child that would never know what it was like to feel safe and believe in herself and live her dreams. A child that society had failed to protect. With nothing more to go on to identify her than her clothing, bonjour jeans, burgundy mohair sweater, full-length black coat, and black patent leather knee-high boots, police needed the public's help. Sadly, to this day, she remains unidentified. She would be named Manhattan Jane Doe. It was assumed by the style of her clothing and the fact that she was found in the seedy hotel room with Didi that she was also a sex worker. Was she a Minnesota Strip victim? Had she come to the big city with dreams of a better life? The way in which these 2 victims were found had brought the murders of many in New York and New Jersey to light. Until then, his killing of female sex workers had gone largely unnoticed because of the trade in which he found his victims. Law enforcement did not see the need to pursue the killings of these women because to society and the city, their lives and deaths were not a priority. There was a belief that these women chose to be sex workers and deserved the risks that came with it. However, the discovery of the mutilated bodies in such a salacious manner forced the police to acknowledge that a serial predator was targeting these women, and the media attention required their action. The details would scare the public and leave the police frustrated knowing there was a sick killer they couldn't catch loose on the streets. This was a new level of excitement for the perpetrator to explore. A sense of intelligence, superiority, and a sly cunning that he had perfected only on his female victims until this point. Why else would a person who started a fire no more than 5 minutes before the fire department arrived take such an enormous risk? Perhaps the dismemberment and the fire was to delay, if not eliminate, identification of the victims, which would lead to an arrest. However, if this were the case, then one would think that the death of 20-year-old Marianne Jean Rayner at the Seville Hotel in New York, just 1 week before Leslie's attack, would have been similar to Didi Godarzi and Manhattan Jane Doe, but it was not. Jean, as she was known, was trying to support herself and win back custody of her son when she ran into her killer. She, like the other victims, had been bound, tortured, raped, violently mutilated, and strangled. By the time her assailant had set her room on fire, he was known as the Torso Killer or the Times Square Ripper. But there was no dismemberment to prevent ID. He had instead cut off her breasts and staged them on the headboard for shock value and degradation. He was again meticulous in his cleanup of the crime scene to leave no trace of his identity. With the arrest of Richard Cottingham for assaulting Leslie and the suspicion of his possible involvement in the murder cases, police were anxious to keep him in custody. After his refusal to admit guilt, he maintained his innocence and claimed that the incident with Leslie was consensual. They had agreed to a specific amount for sex, and that because he intended to pay her, he could do whatever he wanted to her, and with that he lawyered up. Investigators secured a search warrant for any and all Richard's properties. When they searched his house and interviewed his family, friends, and co-workers, they began to grasp the level of sadistic, narcissistic, psychopathic deviant that Leslie had survived behind the family man exterior. His little facade, family, wife Janet and 3 children, nice suburban home, and good job, each had a story to tell that was drastically different than what it appeared. Richard did not find having a normal relationship satisfying and had neglected his relationship with his wife. With his Venus in Scorpio, he may have demonstrated possessiveness and volatility in his relationships and wanted complete loyalty and commitment from Janet, and could have taken advantage of her. They had not had marital relations in years. Have you ever heard the saying, if he's not getting it from you, he's getting it somewhere else? This was despite Janet fitting his preferred appetite of long brunette hair, petite frame, and large breasts. He had been having long-term affairs with at least 2 other women and was arrested and charged with assault, battery, and sodomy of female sex workers on several occasions. He had claimed that he was wrongly accused and it was not his fault. When the charges were dropped after the victims would not testify against him, this only emboldened him to continue. Richard was rarely home, had a room in his basement that was locked that Janet and the children were not allowed to go into, which he spent a significant amount of time in when he was home. He would take vacations without his family and finally stopped supporting them altogether. In 1979, Janet filed for divorce, claiming cruelty and abandonment. Perhaps it was because of these instances of failure for Richard to face any kind of prosecution that he felt that he could get away with anything. This is what he told his co-workers that worked alongside him at Blue Cross Blue Shield, who were the closest witnesses to the level of his depravity. He was known to boast about the lewd escapades on the streets of Times Square. He frequently told them about the swingers club, S&M clubs, gay bars, trans bars, and the by-the-hour hotel rooms with sex workers, some of which he admitted to drugging with drinks at a bar and refusing to pay them for sex. With his sage seduction of oozing charm and sweet, caring, innocent demeanor, and flashes of cash, Richard was confident that he had honed his ability to make sex workers feel like he was an easy mark, and then turn the tables once he had them in his clutches. Richard would explicitly detail the things he would do to them. With this unnerving restlessness, which was like he was about to explode with energy, he told his co-workers that he was always confident talking to the prettiest, best-looking women in the room because he knew that most men were too scared to approach those women out of fear of rejection. But compliance was not his ultimate goal. The most chilling topic that Richard divulged to his co-workers was about what he desired sexually: the bondage, the humiliation, the ruthless domination, the screams. When talk of the murders came up, one co-worker remembered him saying of the killer, "It could have been me." Despite their overall distaste for his personality and the strange and creepy vibe they got from him, they did not take these admissions seriously, and they did nothing. They said nothing to anyone. In fact, they knew he was cheating the time clock and leaving during the hours of his shift at work. For years, they said nothing. You know that saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing? Perhaps they would have said something if they had known that he had made duplicate keys of their homes and was burglarizing them without their knowledge. Okay, this guy was fucking bold. Richard's co-workers would finally voice their distaste for his repulsive revelations when investigators served the warrant on Richard's house. That was when the perfectly placed bricks came crumbling down. The humble home. I feel like saying Act 3, the humble home. A place of smiles and laughter, love and security. A place where children can sleep in peace and dream of wonderful things. This is what a home should be. And perhaps with Richard not in the Lodi, New Jersey home, most of the time, Janet was able to give that to her children. Except for that one room. That room that must have been in the back of her mind. That room that horrified investigators when they opened the locked door. The trophy room. In it, they found BDSM paraphernalia, gags, collars, restraints, handcuffs, pornography involving bondage and violent depictions, and dozens of purses, IDs, jewelry, and women's clothes. Most of the jewelry was costume, but there was one piece, a particular necklace. A necklace that had a photographic history of its own. It was the necklace that Valerie Street always wore. The very necklace that she was photographed wearing in a mugshot at a previous arrest for prostitution. With the discovery of the room, investigators were able to verify that they had indeed a serial predator, and the evidence to prove it. The evidence in the room linked Richard to several unsolved murders and sexual assaults in New York and New Jersey. Even some of the investigators were not aware he was involved in. The details of the cases were so similar to each other: slender, petite women, some but not all sex workers, drugged, taken to a hotel, bound and handcuffed, beaten, bitten on the breasts, strangled and revived, mouth taped shut, restraints used on wrists and necks, and slow, methodical torture with slices or cuts. Looking at the cases and the evidence, it was apparent that he was escalating the viciousness of his attacks and torture techniques in order to heighten his excitement. It was taking more and more cruelty to satiate his aberrant appetite, and he was becoming drunk with derangement in his demand for domination. With the arresting crime having taken place in New Jersey, the court system there was first to try Richard Cottingham for 4 sexual assaults against 4 young women and the murder of Valerie Street at the Quality Inn. Police not only had the testimony from the surviving sexual assault victims, including Leslie Odell, but they also had all the physical evidence obtained from the trophy room in Cottingham's home, as well as the physical evidence from the crime scenes. This included the fingerprint that was a match to him from the handcuffs found on Valerie Street's wrists, and a towel with semen from another crime that matched Cottingham. Despite all the damning evidence, Richard maintained his innocence. He claimed he was framed with evidence planted by a corrupt police force or by the mafia. Funny that his innocence required him to shave his mustache in order to alter his appearance before his lineup to prevent witnesses from identifying him. Again, using his boyish vulnerability, charms, and persuasion, he was able to make his mother, sister, wife, and some co-workers believe in his innocence so much that they not only would support his pleas, but testify in court as alibis when the time came. One of his mistresses would say that Richard treated her well, that he was loving with no S&M predilections, and that the 2-year relationship was even boring. Oh, but there were the times that he would drug her without her consent to sexually assault her, and he had taken her to the same Quality Inn hotel that he took at least 3 of his victims to, so yeah. But she was wise enough to break it off with him after his arrest. Cottingham had a lawyer, but he was used to being in control, and this was not the sort of situation that he was willing to rely on someone else's expertise, even if they had gone to school for years to do it. He tried to lead his own defense. He claimed that he was at work at the time of the crimes, and that the jewelry found in his home was cheap and could have come from anyone. And, of course, the master manipulator that he was, against the advice of counsel, took the stand in his own defense, confident one last time that he could talk his way out of trouble. He testified that his fantasies from a young age involved bondage. I don't think this was going to go well. And when he realized that his charm may not be working, he tried a suicide attempt not once, but twice in the courtroom to garner sympathy. He wanted to make sure that he got off not guilty. 3 days later, the verdict was guilty. New Jersey tried Richard Cottingham for the murder of Marianne Carr, whose house keys had been found in the trophy room. In this trial, there was no jury. Only the judge would decide whether Richard Cottingham was guilty or not. Perhaps seeing that his case was not going well, he decided to try and escape and was running down the courthouse steps when the officers caught him and returned him to face the consequences of his actions. He was again found guilty and sentenced to 25 years to life. Cottingham was then transferred to New York State to stand trial for the deaths of Didi Godarzi, Manhattan Jane Doe, and Jane Rayner. And once again, facing damning evidence, he tried to attempt suicide in front of the jury. He was not successful. He was found guilty and sentenced to 75 years in prison. By 2010, and until as recently as 2023, Cottingham was having his huge ego stroked by investigators, journalists, authors, and family members of victims in order to elicit confessions of other possible crimes and the whereabouts of the missing heads of Didi Godarzi and the young Manhattan Jane Doe. In exchange for their friendship or better treatment in prison, he would provide them with details of crimes he had committed. It was a sick fucking game. And it still is. I think he's on his deathbed now, though, so I guess there's that. With these agreed-upon arrangements, Richard Cottingham had admitted to several more murders that had not been previously linked to him through evidence, including the murders of children. Cottingham eventually confessed to the brutal 1974 unsolved murders of 16-year-old Lorraine Kelly and her friend 17-year-old Marianne Pryor. The girls were last seen hitchhiking to the Paramus Mall to buy bathing suits for a scheduled vacation. Richard stated that he had picked them up and took them to a motel, where he raped and tortured them for 5 days and would threaten violence against the other to maintain compliance. When he was finished with these two frightened children, he drowned them in the bathtub before dumping their bodies naked and beaten in a wooded area to be found. It was speculated that Cottingham took so long to confess to this particular crime because, to his own acknowledgement, he was uncomfortable with the level of sadistic viciousness against victims of such a young age. He also confessed to the murders of Jacqueline Lee, Jackie Harp, 13, in 1968, and Denise Falska, 15, in 1969. All 4 children were from and found in New Jersey. He stated that he committed crimes in Florida, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, as well as New York and New Jersey. He boasted that he had committed crimes about every 2 weeks for 12 years against anywhere from 85 to 100 women and children. The first murder that investigators believe Cottingham may have committed was in January of 1967, the death of Marianne Dalla Sala, 17, or October 1967 death of Nancy Vogel, 29. Both cases have strong circumstantial evidence that links Cottingham to them, particularly the case of wife and mother of 2, Nancy Bobby Vogel. She was known to Cottingham and may have ran into him on her way to play bingo. Staged, naked, beaten, and strangled with her hands bound, she was found in the front seat of her car with her clothes folded neatly underneath her. Cottingham was never one to self-reflect on his own culpability. He maintained that although he claimed remorse, it was the drinking, or the increasingly violent pornography, or that he paid them for their bodies so he could do whatever he wanted, or that as sex workers they deserved to be punished for being bad girls. He blamed the victims. He blamed his wife for his aberrant behavior when the divorce hearing didn't go well the very day he picked up Leslie Odell. The wife that dropped the divorce proceedings when he was arrested and testified in his defense. For whatever reason, his deviance was triggered at a young age, and he never had to face any consequences for his actions, until it was too late for so many young women and children. I do wonder if he mentioned to anyone that the murder of Didi Godarzi and Manhattan Jane Doe was committed on the very weekend of his 33rd birthday. Did he think his brutalization of these women was a perfect present to himself? Between his convictions in New York and New Jersey, Richard Cottingham will never get out of prison. Not alive. Researching this case was not only disturbing because of the level of debasement that Richard Cottingham showed the crimes against these women and children, but also the level of depravity in the treatment of women and children by society and men, in general, even to this day. A society that systematically prevented the survivors of such horrific abuse from coming forward with claims against a savage attacker and brutal murderer. A system that would have punished the survivor because of the things she had to do in a world that was blind to improving her situation. A system that allowed someone to torture and kill these women and children without regard because he knew that their lives were not as valued by society. Most were regarded as runaways or leading high-risk lives. A system in which the killer's friends did not feel the need to tell anyone of his gruesome admissions because they didn't take him seriously, because it was okay to joke about topics like bondage and torture when it comes to vulnerable populations. A system in which the author that wrote a book about Richard Cottingham, that in my opinion showed his own sexist sickness with thinly veiled, overblown, pun intended, vulgar, misogynistic rants, like his excessive, repulsive descriptions of wall-to-wall pussy and the exploitation of women. His statement that over 1,000 diseased hookers at a time, combined with the details of his own sexual expectations in his experience at Times Square at the exact time of these murders, played like one of the graphic magazines that these psychopaths would beat off to. Even commenting on the interview of Richard Cottingham by a female fellow professional as she did not swallow his story whole. Are you fucking serious? Was that sexist comment an attempt at humor? If so, for whose benefit? Was the dehumanization of women not enough with Cottingham's actions that it was necessary to continue with even more professional capacity? Or even his shockingly poor attempt at humor or compassion, I wasn't sure which he was trying to elicit, when describing the housekeeper's reaction to finding the body of Valerie Street under the bed. In my experience, someone with a PhD writing a book about the murders of vulnerable populations hold a position as a professor, lives in a world in which he is more privileged and entitled than half the population just because he is a man, should have more tact, sympathy, and be an example of ethical standards, particularly in this subject matter. Victims of violence, victims of sex traffickers, victims of this broken system are human beings and should be considered with dignity and compassion. I shudder to think about the young minds he has influenced. But yeah, that's my opinion. So, what are today's Madam Roman wisdom highlights? Unfortunately, we don't generally provide solutions in society as a whole to combat the production of predators like Richard Cottingham, but rather put the responsibility of vulnerable groups to protect themselves by prevention. So, number 1, if you're a male and you made it this far, congratulations. You have graduated to the level of knowledge to be better whenever you can. Even if it's just as simple as not telling the seemingly funny joke about a woman or another group of people. Number 2, no. It's a complete sentence. Number 3, if you see red flags, it's not a fucking parade. It's time to go. Thank you for watching and be safe. Sending you silver streaks of wisdom.